Hi everyone. This is the narrated PowerPoint that goes with chapter 23, which is um, the digestive system. And the textbook is Human Anatomy and Physiology, 11th edition by Marieb and Hohen. And my name is Michelle Formiglio. I'm going to be walking you through this. This is about 60 slides, so it's a little bit long. You might want to take a break in the middle of this. I'm going to be writing some notes on the screen. My suggestion is that you follow along in the book, and I'll be referring to a lot of page numbers. So what we have in front of us is really we've got a cute picture of a little stomach eating a hamburger, but then in the middle we have this this huge stretched out alimentary canal. So alimentary means nutrition, I believe. So when you take your whole digestive system and stretch it out, because it really is just one continuous tube with accessory organs which dump stuff into that tube. I'm talking about things like the pancreas, the salivary glands. These are making things and dumping it into this one big canal. But it's incredibly long. So we're going to talk about how many feet long all of this stuff is, and modifications of this big long canal in each different section. And we'll talk about tissue types, we'll talk about functions, and at the end we'll talk about how certain nutrients are broken down. All right, so our general overview. Main job of the digestive system: get the food in, break it down, absorb the molecules, and get rid of the waste. So we have, the first part is known as ingestion. Take food in, and let me get my little highlighter here. So our first one here, ingestion, getting the food into the body, breaking it down into smaller molecules, we call that digestion. And there's two kinds of digestion. There's chemical digestion, and there's also mechanical digestion. So mechanical digestion is going to be where things are being chewed or churned, and then chemical digestion is, of course, when we're adding digestive enzymes to it. And so those are the first two functions. And then the third function is absorbing these molecules, get those molecules into the bloodstream, and then finally getting rid of whatever remains at the end, whatever waste remains. And so I already mentioned that we have two groups of organs. We have our alimentary canal, and then we have accessory organs. So the alimentary canal is going to be also known as the GI tract, not track, it's tract. So it's like duct tape. Anyway, so one big canal all the way through, and then the accessory organs are going to be adding things into that one canal. The alimentary canal is, again, that continuous tube, mouth to anus. It is going to do, everything's going to take place there. It breaks things down, it digests them, it absorbs them, and the main organs that we're going to be discussing that are part of that actual tube are the mouth, the pharynx, the small intestine, the large, oh, I missed the esophagus, I'm sorry, mouth, pharynx, which is our throat, esophagus, which goes right behind the trachea, stomach, small intestine, large intestine. Each of these has their own characteristics, their own specializations, and different things happen in each of these spots. So in a cadaver, when all of the smooth muscle has been relaxed in a body, the alimentary canal can be stretched out to 30 feet long. And because the tube, because things can come into the tube from the outside and proceed through the entire body, almost like a tunnel, and come out the anus, because of that, because it's considered to be outside of the body, even though it's inside of the body. So in general, the things that are being secreted into the digestive system are known as exocrine secretions. And remember, endocrine are just things that endocrine secretions are going into the bloodstream, and exocrine means that they're going anywhere but the bloodstream. And so exo means outside. So in general, things that are in the alimentary canal, they can be vomited out or out the other way, but in any event, you can throw up bile. You can, you will eliminate waste. So all of these things are able to connect to the outside, and that's part of the reason why it's known as exocrine. But we'll get to some of those glands in a little while. The alimentary canal has, as I mentioned, a lot of accessory organs that are going to connect to it or dump things into it. And the teeth are the first. Teeth and tongue are known as accessory organs. And then our salivary glands are, we have 3 sets of them, and those are going to dump secretions into the mouth. And those are going to actually kickstart the process of digestion. As we go down through the digestive system, once we get past the stomach, we're gonna have a junction where the pancreas and the liver / gallbladder are going to drain their secretions, and those are all considered, things that are being dumped into, as I'm saying. So secretions from the pancreas, some of those secretions are exocrine, the ones we'll discuss. And the gallbladder, again, is going to be secreting as well. So or excreting, I guess you could say. But we'll discuss all of these as we go along. I'm just grabbing my PowerPoint here so I can follow along, not get ahead of myself. All right. I'm going to move my picture. I don't even know if I can. Bummer. Okay. So I'm sorry about this over here, but at least you can see some of what's going on. Let me turn this off. Okay, so the good way to think of the digestive system is as an assembly line or a disassembly line. So we're taking food and we are breaking it down smaller, 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 and then there are a lot of processes that are active in that. So first of all, over here, we have the term ingestion. We already discussed what ingestion is here. So ingestion is going to be getting that food into the body. And then the second term here, we did not discuss yet, but propulsion is actually getting that food moved from one spot to the other. And so swallowing is part of that. And then there's a term called peristalsis. So peristalsis is over here. And this is in your book on page 871, has this exact picture. So I thought I could move myself, but apparently I can't. But you'll see this picture here on page 871, so you can see it better. So mechanical digestion, peristalsis. And so this tube that we're looking at, this tube right here, is either, in this case, it's coming from the mouth. So we'll say this is the esophagus. Once we have a ball of food, we call it a bolus, B-O-L-U-S, bolus. That's a bolus of food. Once we have a bolus of food, this happens throughout the digestive system, but once we have a mass of food or even a mass of liquid, really, the tube that it's going to be sitting in is going to be lined with smooth muscle. And that smooth muscle contracts kind of from the part of the tube above the ball, and it squeezes, and then it pushes that ball down a little bit more, and then the next section squeezes and pushes it down, squeezes and pushes it down. And that's called peristalsis. It is an involuntary action. It is done by like I said, the smooth muscle. And I always think of, if you can think of a long tube sock. So let's say you have a big sock and you're trying to get a ball. Let's say it's a golf ball. You're trying to get that into the toe of the sock. So you're going to stick it in and hold the top of the sock, and then you're going to kind of squeeze above the ball until it gets all the way down to the bottom. And that's what peristalsis is. So that's peristalsis. So we then can move into what we could call mechanical digestion. Mechanical digestion is where you are like physically breaking it down. And so we have chewing, obviously, is going to do a lot of that. The tongue is actually going to help with that. We have some mixing going on in the mouth. We have mixing going on in the stomach. Churning, we would call it in the stomach, really. And then we have something called segmentation, which is very, very similar to peristalsis. It's kind of a form of peristalsis. And so what happens then is we're squeezing sections down, but then another one will come from above, and then muscles in between those two balls squeeze, and it kind of mixes part of the top one with the one underneath it, and then it mixes the bottom half with the one underneath that. So it's kind of blending them together, and you can kind of see that here a little bit. Sorry, I'm still trying to figure out. Oh, there. I think I just made it disappear. Hopefully I did. But this is what's going to end up happening. We're going to have the pieces mixed together. Little chunks kind of mix and blend, and that's another way of doing a good job mixing the food physically. So that's called segmentation. Okay, so then if I didn't disappear just then for you guys, then I'm sorry. Page 871, segmentation. Okay, so then we have chemical digestion. So the term we just spent some time discussing was segmentation. So then we have chemical digestion. This is going to involve enzymes. We'll talk about this a little bit later. We have absorption, and this is getting the digested stuff into the bloodstream. Or in the case of fat, we would absorb it through lymphatic capillaries in the same place that the rest of things would be digested, and we'll talk about later. And then we have defecation, which is, of course, elimination. So here's just another view. I like to give a lot of different views of things, but this one is on page 870. This is figure 23.2. And these are all of the things that we just discussed, but we also have a little add in here with some chemical digestion. I'm going to try to circle it. Nope, that's nowhere near where I need to be. Sorry about that. Okay, so I wanted to get black. So chemical digestion is anytime you see this little raindrop looking thing, they're showing you that this is where digestion comes in with chemicals. That's not good. Sorry about that. Anyway, so we have the food going in. We have mechanical digestion where we're chewing it, churning it. We have the food entering through, and we have propulsion happening. So that means that we're moving it along. This is where we're going to have that segmentation and peristalsis. Our stomach is going to be doing that churning, and then we're going to start adding some chemicals in, and toward the end, we're left with mainly water, bacteria have a job there, and then feces, and then we have defecation. So here's all of our steps. Really, I kind of feel like there should be one little, I'm going to try to draw a little raindrop up here, sort of ish, in the mouth, because there are digestive enzymes in the saliva, which we'll talk about in just a minute. This slide is, I don't see an exact picture. This is in your lab manual, actually. And I find this particular picture to be it's a little confusing to me, just to see it this way, but it's really the best way to diagram this, except just explaining it. So when you learned about tissue types, you should have learned the epithelial tissues were, one of the four main groupings of tissues, and your serous membranes were membranes that were made of epithelium that secretes a lubricating fluid. And within the lungs, we would call that pleura. Within the around the heart, we would call that pericardium, and in the digestive system, or in the abdominal cavity, we would use the word peritoneum. So peritoneum is serous membrane that we find in multiple locations and in the abdomen, or yeah, an abdomen. And so one layer of this peritoneum sits directly on top of the organs, and that is colored. This greater and lesser peritoneal cavity we're not really worrying about, but the parietal or the visceral peritoneum would be sitting on top of each organ. So don't pay attention to the red and the blue right now. I just want you to see, so this is the liver, this is the stomach. Again, we're looking at a sagittal section, so it's going to look sort of weird. This is part of the small intestine. All of these are small intestine. This is part of the rectum, bladder, I'm sorry, uterus, bladder, and this is a bone. So sitting on a lot of these organs, we're talking about the visceral peritoneum, and then lining the whole cavity is parietal peritoneum. And all of this is the peritoneal cavity. There are some structures that are, so if you can picture this cavity as having a lining, right? So it kind of goes like this-ish. That lining actually kind of cuts off in this area. And then there are structures, actually, let me rewind this. I'm not very good at drawing this. I'm going to show you this in a little bit. Let me go with purple for you. So we kind of have this peritoneal cavity, right? And then what I'm drawing right here is like where the peritoneum goes, and it kind of like, it goes in front of some organs. And so the area behind the peritoneum is known as, not the spinal cord, not the spine, but the area behind it is known as retroperitoneal. And so some sections of the digestive system are considered to be behind this, like the kidneys are behind this, the pancreas is behind this. Those are known as retroperitoneal. Part of the bladder is, so when we're talking about the peritoneal cavity, we're kind of talking about this whole area in here. So this peritoneum is also going to make up some tissues, other tissues that are found in the digestive system. And those are going to be the mesocolon, the greater omentum, the mesentery, and the lesser omentum. So we're going to talk about those in just a second. They're still peritoneal membranes. They just have different functions than sitting on the organ or in the cavity. This is a mess. I'm so sorry. Let's erase this. Okay. All right, so here's our mesentery over here. The mesentery, whenever you see M-E-S-E-N-T, mesentery or mesenteric, it has to do with intestine. Can't even see the rest of that, but I think you get it. So when we did the blood vessels, we learned about the superior mesenteric and inferior mesenteric arteries. And so that's, that's what that word means. It means intestine. So mesentery, the mesenteries are sheets of peritoneum. So we're not talking about something that's just sitting on an organ and lining it, or sitting in a cavity that lines it. Same type of tissue, serous membrane with lots of lubrication, but it acts to anchor organs in place. So the mesentery's job, one of the main jobs, is to anchor these organs to the walls of the abdomen. The mesenteries also have a role in providing protected passageways for nerves and blood vessels. So the three types of mesentery that we have are going to be the mesocolons, and then the greater omentum and the lesser omentum. And so let me highlight these in different colors for you. This organ right here is all stomach. This part I'm highlighting right here is known as the greater omentum, and it sits and it kind of actually clings to the underside of the liver and the gallbladder. And then this part right here is known as the greater omentum. And it actually continues down in front of all of this stuff, but they've cut it in this view. So I have different views of that to show you in a minute. And then there were, of course, the retroperitoneal organs, which I mentioned. They're kind of behind all of this stuff. So part of the rectum, the pancreas is retroperitoneal, and we'll get to that stuff in a minute. And then there is a disorder that I wanted to mention to you, which is known as peritonitis. And so if someone gets an infection in the peritoneal cavity, we would call it peritonitis. And it can be really dangerous because all of the things in the intestine or all of the things in the abdominal cavity are connected. And so if you've gotten something into the peritoneal cavity, whatever infection that is can spread all over. So everyone hears about someone whose appendix almost burst and how dangerous it was. That would lead to peritonitis. So itis itself, guys, just means inflammation. It just means inflammation. But it's usually going to be from an infection. So if there is a wound, if there is a surgical procedure that was not sterile, if there is a ruptured appendix, if there is, you know, even pelvic inflammatory disease that's caused by an infection, which we'll talk about in a couple weeks. All of these things could lead to leaching of things into the peritoneal cavity and could very quickly spread and become very dangerous. So let's move forward. These are a couple of nasty pictures of the mesenteries, but they are double layered folds of the peritoneum. And their job is to support and stabilize intraperitoneal organs. So we're not talking about retroperitoneal. We're not talking about along the back wall where the kidneys are. We're talking about things within the front of the ventral cavity, anterior ventral cavity. And so in this case, we can see this is an actual cadaver, but we see the mesentery. It's almost like a webbing that sits here in these spaces. And this would be the small intestine. So I'll do that in red. Small intestine here. And then we have our mesenteries. Now, the mesentery is also going to have, let me erase that because that's not small intestine. Mesentery is also going to have, I'll do blue, these little passageways weaving through, which are good for blood vessels and nerves to be able to pass through, and kind of holds everything together. And then you can see it again over here. We have our stomach, we have the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. All of this is small intestine, small intestine, small intestine. But this whole part in the middle here, which I should have done that color, I'll do this color. All of this is all mesentery. It kind of holds it all together. These are a couple pictures of our ommenta. So the stomach is sort of like a J-shaped organ. And we're going to learn about that in just a minute. But it kind of has like this appearance to it a little bit. And this part right here is known as the lesser curvature of the stomach. And then the bottom part here is the greater curvature. And so the greater omentum of the abdomen is going to hang kind of from the bottom here, and it runs all the way across and sits on top of all of the intestines. And so we call it a fatty apron. It traps a lot of fat. That's where belly fat comes from. It's trapped. So that's the greater omentum. It runs from the greater curvature of the stomach down. And then the lesser omentum, in this picture, we can see the lesser curvature of the stomach. This little guy over here is the gallbladder. And then all of this is the liver. And so they've pulled the liver back for us to see the omentum underneath. And so the lesser omentum is like a webbing that kind of webs up underneath, but it's going to tuck underneath of the liver. It would be kind of under here on this side, but from the upper curve, the lesser curvature of the stomach. So we have all these organs, and they're not just sitting there. They're held in place from behind, from the front. They're tied together. They have webbing holding them. So the lesser omentum attaches to the stomach and upper duodenum. Again, duodenum is the beginning of the small intestine. To the inferior surface of the liver. Greater omentum is going to go all the way down and cover the small intestines and inferior abdominal organs. These are really a little bit easier to understand when you've got them on a dissected specimen. I'm just looking to find a couple in your lab manual, but I don't see any cadaver pictures here. Or in your lecture book, rather. All right, let's move on to the next slide, which is, sorry, the actual walls of the intestine. Okay, these walls are known as tunics. Tunics are layers. We learned about the tunics that are involved with the cardiovascular system. There are 4 tunics that go with the alimentary canal. And these tunics they're pretty much always present, but they're just the morphology of them, or they're different. They're arranged differently. Sometimes they're thicker in certain tissue types. Like the stomach, for example, has all these layers, but the stomach also has modified mucous membrane. It also has extra muscle. The esophagus, the outer layer, is made of a little bit of a different tissue, but these are the general walls. And so the innermost wall, which is touching the mucosa is going to be, which is touching the lumen, is our innermost section. So in this picture, it's green. This is the mucosal layer. It's going to have goblet cells. Remember, it's touching something that came into contact from the outside of your body. And so anything that comes into contact from the outside of your body is going to be mucous membrane. We just discussed this with the respiratory system. So your submucosal area is the next one out, your submucosal layer. I'm trying to highlight it here, but this is not very user-friendly. Submucosa. Your submucosa is going to have a lot of blood vessels in it and a lot of nerves. So we'll talk about that. Then we have a couple muscularis layers. We have an orangish one here. We have this sort of limey one here. Those are smooth muscle. And then we have serosa, which in most cases in the digestive system, it's going to be, it'll be that visceral peritoneum that we talked about. The esophagus, the outer layer of the esophagus is not serosa. It's made of a connective tissue because it's not in the abdomen. So there's a better diagram of this in your textbook, or a different diagram, I'll say, on page 873. All right, so remember I said whenever you have entero or mesentero, entero means intestine. So the enteric nervous system is the section of the nervous system devoted entirely to digestion. We call this the gut brain. So we say that the GI tract actually has its own little nervous system, and this is something that's been studied for a really long time. There are over 100 million neurons which regulate the digestive system. We know that there's the sympathetic nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system. They have different impacts on digestion. Digestion is very complicated. There are a lot of factors involved, a lot of hormones and impulses being sent to coordinate all of it. So it has its own little nervous system, and you need to know the group's 2 plexuses that go with that. When you learned the spinal nerves, you should have learned about nerve plexuses in mp4. So you should have learned about like the cervical plexus, the brachial plexus. They're groupings of nerves that are serving a common purpose. So in this case, we have the submucosal nerve plexus, and that is the second layer out that I had mentioned to you. And this submucosal nerve plexus regulates the glands in that area, the mucosa in that area. So the submucosal one is going to involve secretions, really. And then the myenteric nerve plexus, remember myo means muscle, and entero means intestine. So this nerve plexus controls the muscles of digestion, the muscles, a smooth muscle. So this nerve plexus, the myenteric nerve plexus, is going to be the one responsible for controlling how fast or slow food goes through your digestive system. This enteric nervous system is going to send information to the brain, and it's going to also receive information from the autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system was the nervous system that involved the sympathetic and parasympathetic sections. So remember, parasympathetic involved rest and digest. And so your enteric nervous system is going to be the resting and digesting. The digesting part of that is going to be controlled by the myenteric section. And then the sympathetic impulses inhibit secretion and motility. So that's going to do the opposite. And that's going to, also myenteric is going to be in charge of slowing things down or speeding things up. So the gut brain is getting its information from the autonomic nervous system. All right, when you are dealing with digestion, there are lots of stimuli that are involved. I kind of mentioned this a couple slides ago, basically that it's super complicated and there's a lot of players kind of dancing together for this to happen. So some hormones are secreted that cause release of other chemicals, and in order for those glands to know what to do, we have to have stimuli receptors detecting stimuli in order to have this process continue. And so one of the things that's detected is stretch receptors are going to be triggered when there's food. Another thing that's detected is that the fluid that's in our digestive system is going to change. Once food enters that area, we're going to see pH changes, and we're going to see, as you're mixing food with the solutions in your system, there will be changes in the chemical consistency of that, and really just the food being there in the first place, like all of these things, stretching, the body's really detecting the chemicals that are entering into the body. When those things begin to be noticed, I guess you could say, by the body, then it triggers a whole bunch of other effects. And also, even just smell, right, will trigger this whole thing. So once the party gets started, once the food gets in, once this whole thing starts, the body's like, okay, we must be eating. Things are starting to stretch, and there's chemicals being detected. Then we have the smooth muscle becoming active. So the beginning of the esophagus, or really the proximal esophagus, we're dealing with skeletal muscle really still. But once it gets past that point, it's going to continue down, and it's smooth muscle after that. And that just kind of takes over automatically. Once that smooth muscle starts, it's going to just continue to move peristalsis all the way down, continue to move the food along. And then at the same time, that triggers this whole series of events. We're going to start having those glands secreting things. So there are two, let me give you a page number here. Sorry about that. Enteric nervous system's on 874, and where I'm at right now, this is on page 875. It does not say once the party gets started, but it does say some of these terms that I'm using right now. So once the party gets started, then we start seeing secretion of these things. And then there are controls in that area that are going to regulate what's happening. Those hormones are produced by multiple areas: the stomach, the small intestine, the pancreas. We've got them impacting the gallbladder. So what's interesting about the stomach is that the brain is very much in control. We would call that extrinsic control because it's not in the digestive system. But there's also intrinsic control, where the tissues in the intestine themselves or in the digestive system themselves can sort of self-regulate, and it's a very complicated process. So it's a lot of people feel that our intestines, our gut, kind of does a lot more than we realize it does, and it influences homeostasis in our body more than we realize. So the intrinsic controls are going to be things that happen within the digestive system itself. I'm thinking here, I'm trying to remember if we discussed prostaglandins or not, but those are hormones that act locally. So they're secreted into the surrounding tissue and cause reactions there. Those would be known as intrinsic controls. And then, of course, like I said, the brain is going to have some control as well. So now that we've done a little discussion of, the layers of the walls, how it's controlled, some of the peritoneal layers, and, the terms involved, segmentation, peristalsis. Now we're going to get going on just discussing these organs that are listed on this page. So we have mouth, pharynx, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine. What I would do if I were you is, and this is a technique that I had discussed when we did the heart and, even the lungs. Oops, sorry about that. I would kind of number the steps as we go through them. So these are just 6 simple steps, but there are different parts to the small intestine and large intestine. And there are also some little valves in between these that we'll mention. So if I were you, I'd kind of keep track. I'd definitely start, number 1 is the mouth, and number 2 is the pharynx, 3 esophagus, but then we're going to start seeing like a valve for 4, and then stomach, and then a valve for 6, and then small intestine, and multiple stages to that. So just kind of keep a running list. We're going to start with the mouth. This is a structure that we've already talked about when we did our respiratory system. So we have our oral cavity. We're talking about this zone in here. And we have our hard palate in the front. I'm going to erase that. Sorry. Okay. So we have our hard palate in the front here, and we have the soft palate in the back here. And this area above is going to be nasopharynx and nasal cavity. We're not concerned about that for this section. What we are concerned with is this section here. And once the food gets to this area, then it's going to go down the back way here. This is the back tube, esophagus. All right, so the oral cavity is lined with stratified squamous epithelium. The reason is because there's a lot of friction in the mouth, and we're eating food that's really rough. And if that was any other tissue type, it would be damaged and it wouldn't repair very fast, if at all. So and the thick stratified component of that is going to make it so that it's very difficult to, bleed to get to the lower sections of the tissue. So, I think what I'm trying to say here is that the stratified okay, I was trying to clear this slide so I could start over, but it's not letting me. Okay, anyway, so so the stratified component of this, the stratified is multiple layers. Okay. So one more time. So stratified means multiple layers, and squamous means they're flattened cells. So this is going to withstand a lot of damage without causing bleeding, because that stratified, that thickness, is going to allow for a lot of damage to happen before it reaches blood vessels. So palate, hard palate, soft palate, and then we had discussion last time about swallowing and breathing, right? So the uvula is going to drop down and kind of block food from going up into the nasal cavity, and our larynx is also going to help prevent food from going down the back pipe or the the front pipe. So we don't want any food going down into the trachea. Sorry about that slide. I'm really tired, just like you guys are. All right, keep going here. All right, so here's the tongue. And we know what the tongue does. It's going to smoosh the food around in our mouth. It's going to actually help break it down a little bit. When food enters the mouth, if it's not mixed with saliva and it's not made into this bolus that we were talking about early on, then it's going to be very difficult to effectively move down the esophagus. And so the tongue is responsible for, and the lips and the cheeks are responsible for forming it into this bolus, but then there's saliva that's going to help make that happen as well. And so this little piece right here that's sticking down attaches the tongue to the floor of the mouth. That's known as the lingual frenulum, and it's just like a little ligament. In this case, I think this is an extra long one. They call it tongue-tied. Some little ones, when they're born, they have kind of a different lingual frenulum, and they have to have it adjusted so that they can eat properly and speak properly. Salivary glands are next. Here is one of them. There's a pair of these called the parotid glands, P-A-R-O-T-I-D. And then we have one just under the tongue. This guy is called the sublingual gland. And then we have one just kind of at the mandible, just below the mandible, known as the submandibular. So those are your three types: parotid, submandibular, and sublingual. And the salivary glands have lots of jobs. We know one of them is to obviously make that bolus wet so that it can be swallowed, but it's also going to be active it's really active in taste. You can't taste things very well at all unless the tongue is wet. So in all your extra quarantine time, because we're all dealing with this in our own ways, this quarantine, dry your tongue off. Get a napkin, dry off your tongue, and then try to eat something, and it will be very difficult to taste. So that saliva is going to kind of almost activates the taste buds-ish, and allows us to taste a little bit better. But the saliva helps dissolve the chemicals in food. One of the things it does is that it begins the process of digesting starch, and the enzyme involved with that is known as amylase, A-M-Y-L-A-S-E. So really, once a carb, touches the saliva, it begins digesting. It's going to continue digesting until, further along it goes. The pancreas also secretes some amylase, but in this case, we would call it salivary amylase. Saliva is mostly water. It is slightly acidic, and the reason for that is because bacteria do not like, the ones that bother us are the ones that like kind of what our normal pH is. A lot of bacteria do not like too much of a shift from neutral. And so a little bit of acid might impact, it might discourage certain bacteria to grow there. And these glands are known as extrinsic glands because they are not inside the body. So they're exocrine glands. And so they're pairs too. I don't know if I mentioned that. Okay, this picture, the mouth stuff is on 876. Picture very similar to this is on 878. And I'm just looking at your study guide really quickly, and that's where I am. So it says define and locate each of the salivary glands, amylase, and we need to discuss deglutition. So that's where we're at. We're moving down our little review guide right now. The amount of salivation that we produce each day is insane. So here is a 500 milliliter bottle. 3 of these a day is how much saliva we make a day. So 1.5 liters, yeah, that's crazy. Almost a soda bottle, a lot. So these glands are going to continually keep the mouth moist. The secretions are going to be stimulated. I already mentioned what's going to cause these to become more active. So when we smell things, when chemoreceptors trigger in our mouth, right, when we've added food, and then of course part of that is going to be coming from the brain, whether there's smells, whether there's stretch receptors further down. These salivary glands are going to become more active. All right, a little bit about our teeth. So teeth and the associated terms. This is what we need to do now. And actually, I don't know if we did deglutition yet. I think it's on the next slide. I think we did. But anyway, all right. So the term mastication, if you remember the muscle that's like on the side of your cheek, is known as the masseter muscle. Mastication is the action of chewing. So it's action of opening and closing the jaw. And yeah, so mastication is chewing. That's kind of all there is to that word. All right. So we have deciduous teeth and secondary teeth. Deciduous teeth are baby teeth, and there are 20 of them once all the baby teeth come in. Deciduous teeth fall out, and then secondary teeth come in. Our secondary teeth, we have 32 of them, and as you know, they don't grow back. I actually have a cavity. I gotta go to the dentist tomorrow. Not happy. But anyway, so deciduous, I always think of the trees that their leaves fall and then they come back, like oak trees or whatever. Those are known as deciduous trees. So I think of deciduous teeth the same way. They fall out and they come back only once. And so you don't need to memorize this little table down here with the different years that these teeth come in, but I thought it was kind of interesting. Here it is, the wisdom teeth. 17 to 25 years is when they come in. And then about 6 years to 7 years is when a lot of these other ones come in. 6 years, 7 years, 8 years. That's when the teeth are like so weird looking. It's like the mouth is all different teeth sizes. But anyway, so let's discuss the differences between the 4 teeth types. And that picture on the top is crazy, right? So that's really what a child's jaw would look like. We have all these teeth that are kind of waiting to come in. It's crazy. Anyway, so we have 4 different types of teeth. We have incisors, canines, premolars, and molars. The way that our mouth looks, this is on page 879, our mouth looks this way. Our teeth have all these different forms because of the diet that we have as people. So if you look at the mouth of any organism, you can tell what kind of food they eat. And for us, we have these incisors and canines, which are sharp. And then in the back, we have these premolars and molars, and those are flat. So what this means is that the flat teeth are going to allow for us to eat vegetables and plants, and then the sharp teeth are going to be the ones that allow us to eat meat. And so we have what we call mixed morphology of our teeth. So anyway, the incisors are, think of scissors, C-I-S means like scissor, means sharp. So the incisors are the sharp flat ones. The canines can be pointy, and we see off to the side. Premolars and molars are the flat ones in the back. So those are 4 types. Just looking to see what else is on your list here. Okay. All right, so now we're just going to discuss the structure of the teeth. Here's a general overview of what a tooth looks like. The book has, on 880, they have like a little bit of a different tooth. Just find this in our guide here. All right. Terms to know. I'm going to highlight them for you. Gingiva, or in this case, gingival margin. So gingiva are gums. You see, it should be labeled for you somewhere. It's not for some reason, but here it is. This is your gums. And those are known as gingiva. So then the regions of a tooth are named based on where they fall in regards to that gum line. So anything that is above the gum line. Oh no. I'm so sorry. I can't go back. I thought I could. But so let me just try to explain what was on that slide. I'll go back and redo it if I can, but if I can't, then check out the picture on page 880 in your book. So really, where the gum line is, the section of tooth that's like right in line with that is known as the neck. So the neck is like right along the gum line. And then anything above that is the crown, and anything below that is the root. And crown, neck, root. So that root is sealed in place by what's called cementum. And it's like cement. It keeps that tooth from falling out. The bulk of the tooth is made of dentin, and then we have the pulp, or the cavity, really. So it's not a cavity, but it's a space where there's a pulpy material, and that's where we have nerves and blood vessels. And within that, there's a root. So that root is what's going to contain all of those and sort of seals it down, connects it down into the jaw. So when someone has a root canal, we actually have a root canal. It's a normal term, but what a root canal is when they actually pull that stuff out of the root, so that the pain is gone. All right, so now let me do this slide. I'm gonna, hopefully my picture disappeared again. So we talked a little bit about, some of those structures in the mouth, and now we need to talk about the digestive processes that are going to happen, like what's being done there. So we know that we're ingesting it. We're mechanically breaking it down with the tongue and with the cheeks and even the lips a little bit. And then we have propulsion that's happening, deglutition, which is the term for swallowing. And we also have chemical digestion happening there with amylase, salivary amylase, and that's carbohydrate starch that are going to be broken down. So those are the designed jobs for the stomach. So then, for the mouth. And so we also have the ability to absorb some drugs under the tongue, fentanyl, nitroglycerin. People absorb medical marijuana, CBD, all that stuff can go under the tongue. A lot of medications can go under the tongue now. They go right into the bloodstream. So here's our pharynx. Isn't this a pretty picture? I think it's pretty. So we discussed already the respiratory system, and the nasopharynx was kind of that greenish part on the top there. And then we have our soft palate right here. And so this bluish zone is the oropharynx. That's the back of the mouth, but this is the oropharynx, and then this is the laryngopharynx. And so here's our epiglottis. This little guy is our epiglottis. So once the food moves through, it's going to enter into the back of the oral cavity here, which is the beginning of the pharynx, and that's the oropharynx. And this is also stratified squamous epithelium. If we're talking about air, it's going to go down through the air would go down through into the trachea, and that's ciliated epithelium. We're not going that way. We're staying along the back root, so we're staying with stratified squamous epithelium. So we're going to go down into the laryngopharynx and then down into the esophagus. There's a cool video right here about swallowing, and it's deglutition, again, is the word. It's neat. It's a person who's having a swallow study done, and you can actually see the epiglottis move. It's cool. So it's very short. You can check it out. I believe she swallowed, or he, I don't know. I think it's a she, but she swallows a liquid and a solid, and they study the movement of the structures in this space with X-ray. So if you're doing your list, it would be 1, mouth. 2 would be like your pharynx, but then you'd kind of put like oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. And then you're going to get to the third step, which is the esophagus, and this is where we're at now. The esophagus is pretty long. It's about 10 inches or so long. The esophagus really has one job, and that's to get the food from here to here. We want to get it from the mouth pharynx area down to this section right here, the beginning of the stomach. Also stratified squamous epithelium. So we're really talking about stratified squamous epithelium all the way down to the stomach. Then we convert to simple columnar epithelium all the way down to the end of the stomach, all the way down until the rectum, and then it's stratified squamous again. So it's stratified squamous till the stomach, and then it's simple columnar until the rectum, and then it's stratified squamous again. So the pharynx, the esophagus from the pharynx to the stomach, it starts out having skeletal muscle here. And then once the food has passed the very proximal aspect of the esophagus, it then becomes smooth muscle. So once food passes the skeletal muscle stage, it will propel along by itself with that smooth muscle. And that's the peristalsis starting. So there's no digestion happening here. The only thing that's digesting really is whatever starch there might be that was present from the amylase in the saliva. And so within the diaphragm, there's a hole. It's known as the esophageal hiatus, and that allows the esophagus to pass through the diaphragm and enter into the abdominal cavity. And so at the bottom of the esophagus, so we had mouth, we had oropharynx, laryngopharynx, esophagus. After the esophagus, there's a little sphincter before the stomach. It's right at this red mark right here. So I would call that 4. I would say number 4 is the gastroesophageal sphincter. So what this means when you break it up is stomach, esophagus. Sometimes we use the letters GE, GE sphincter. A sphincter is a round muscle that can open and close. We talked about precapillary sphincters. So the GE sphincter, what this does, guys, is if there's food in the stomach, the GE sphincter kind of holds it into the stomach to prevent it from going back up again, because the stomach is modified to allow for all the chemicals that are in the stomach, for the acids in the stomach. The stomach is like okay to handle that. The esophagus is not. So the lining of the esophagus will burn big time if acids from the stomach leach their way back up. And so there's this sphincter there. Once the food passes it, it should stay closed. It really shouldn't open back up again. The food should stay in the stomach after that point. Here's a little video of peristalsis if you want to check it out. I don't think I have that feature available in the way that I'm recording this, but you can definitely pause it, obviously. All right, so deglutition was swallowing, and there are 2 phases of deglutition, lots of muscle groups involved, and this is on page 883. All right, so what's going on? We have 2 phases, the buccal or buccal phase, and buccal meant cheek. So the first stage of swallowing is voluntary. These muscles in here are voluntary. So buccal phase or buccal phase in the mouth, completely voluntary, skeletal muscle. And then there is the pharyngeal esophageal phase that is involuntary. The brainstem is going to control that. So once you start to swallow something, you don't have control over it anymore after that. When you swallow, breathing is inhibited, and yeah. So we're basically closing off the, so the food comes in, and when airway is stopped, that means that obviously the epiglottis is going to cover the glottis, but then also the nasopharynx is kind of closed off as well by the uvula, really. So we're closing off areas of respiration, and we're just trying to focus on smushing that food down the digestive tract or the esophagus. Our stomach is our next stop. And so I would list that as 6, I think it was. The stomach is a big storage pouch. Food can stay in there a long time. It can just sit there. Your body can close off that GE or gastroesophageal sphincter, and then we have our stomach, and then at the end of the stomach, it can close off again. And food can stay in there. So if you're in a sympathetic situation, right, where you have fight or flight, we're not worrying about digesting, that food can stay there for a long time without being digested. And the body controls that. The autonomic nervous system is in control of sending blood flow to these areas. You know, my enteric nerve plexus is going to be, whether there's stimulation of that or not, depends on the autonomic nervous system. So location of the stomach, upper left quadrant of your abdomen, and it is meant to be a temporary storage. Within the stomach, there are lots of chemicals that are in there, and once food mixes with all of those chemicals, it turns into like a mashed potato-y kind of consistency. And we call that chyme, C-H-Y-M-E. So we mixed it all together. We made this very acidic chyme, and that chyme is what's going to move forward into the next part of the digestive system. So the regions of the stomach, the top region, hold on one sec. Actually, I'm going to discuss these regions on the next slide and curvatures because it's a better picture. But this picture here I wanted to show you because you can see that it looks like worms on there, but it's actually all folds. And those are called rugae or rugae. And those folds allow the stomach to kind of shrink down when there's nothing in it. And then when there is food in it, they allow it to expand. We also have them in the bladder. This is a slide that is depicting that stomach again, so we can see these gastric folds, which I called rugae. And then we have our esophagus, of course, here. This right here would be the gastroesophageal sphincter. And here is our lesser curvature. Here is our greater curvature. That is not very good. Try it again. Sorry, you guys. Greater curvature. That's better. So a couple things to point out here. This area right in here, this sort of zone, is known as the cardia or cardiac region. Cardia. And this happens to be right beneath the heart. So the heart is right above. And so when someone has heartburn, the reason is because of this whole situation going on right in here. I just made a big mess. But if I have acids leaking, I did it again. I'm so sorry. So I'm going to try to draw it. Here we go. Oh my God, I did it again. All right, I'm going to go back here. Hopefully I can re-record these slides. All right, so stomach looked kind of like this-ish. All right, down at the end, we had an opening that's going to be leading down into the small intestine. And this is where food's going to go down here. This was our lesser curvature. This is our greater curvature. Awful, I'm so sorry. So right in here, there was a sphincter known as the the gastroesophageal sphincter. And this region right up in here is known as the cardiac region, right underneath of the heart. This is, you got to look at the book for this one because, okay, that's 885, top 885. So the cardiac region. Then we have an area that kind of bumps over the top a little bit, and this is known as the fundus right here. This region in here is known as the body. And then the lowest region is known as the pyloric region. And then at the very, very end right here, before we enter the small intestine, we have another valve. Now, when I say valve, we use the words valve and sphincter pretty much the same way. They're really meant for food to go one direction and not back the other way. So this one is called the pyloric sphincter, or I'm going to write valve, pyloric valve. There we go. Pyloric valve. Let me see if there was anything else on here. No, that's it. Okay. This is terrible, but 885. All right. So I really wish I could go back, and I'm trying to figure out how to do that. Hopefully I'll figure it out at the end and then I can re-record. So if none of what I'm saying right now makes any sense, then don't worry about it. So I'm going to discuss right now the slide prior, which was about what happens within the stomach. So ignoring what's on the slide right here, I'm going to talk to you about what happens in the stomach. So there are 4 layers of four layers of tissue on the stomach, same as what we had before, but the muscular layers are altered quite a bit because they are doing a lot of churning. Another thing that we have going on there is the secretion of gastric juice. So the mucosal layer, the layer that's lining the inside of the stomach, I don't really want to mess with this anymore because every time I do it, it kind of messes up. But the lining of the inside of the stomach is mucous membrane, and we call it the mucosal layer. And that mucous membrane is going to secrete lots of fun stuff. One other thing it secretes is mucus to protect the walls of the stomach. But it also secretes gastric juice, and so that's going to be made of a few things. One of them is hydrochloric acid. One of them is known as pepsin. Pepsin breaks down polypeptides, which are proteins. So pepsin breaks down proteins. Pepsin will not work unless there's an acidic condition. So the hydrochloric acid has to be secreted in order for pepsin to start breaking down proteins. And the other thing that you're responsible for understanding is the term lipase, L-I-P-A-S-E. Lipases are going to break down lipids. Lipo means lipid. So in that stomach, we've done a lot of things. We started breaking down proteins. We really kind of killed bacteria that might have entered that area because there's so much hydrochloric acid. And we've also started breaking down lipids or fats with lipase. Another thing, a couple other terms, denaturing or denaturization. Denaturing is when proteins are broken and destroyed. And so 2 things really can cause denaturing to happen. One is pH changes, and another is temperature changes. So in this case, the pH shifts did a great job at breaking down proteins that might have entered the area. So then what's going to happen with that at the end, once we have all that mixture, we have chyme, C-H-Y-M-E. So we have this acidic sort of ball of food that's going to then be squeezed a little bit at a time into the small intestine. In order to go into the small intestine, we need to pass through this pyloric valve. So I think we had 5 as the gastroesophageal sphincter, and then we had stomach, and so then I would put pyloric valve or pyloric sphincter at the end, for the next step. All right, so now we're where we should be, which is about how this is regulated. We already talked about the nerve plexus is involved and that there are many hormones involved. So we had 1,500 milliliters or 1.5 liters of saliva each day. We have 3 liters of gastric juice secreted in a day. When the vagus nerve, which is part of the parasympathetic stimulation, when that's stimulated, secretion of our juices increases because we're digesting. Sympathetic stimulation is going to lead to kind of a cutting short of any digestion that's happening there, which is going to slow down secretion, slow down gastric juice creation, slow down motility. 3 phases. You need to make sure you understand the 3 phases of gastric activity. The first one is the cephalic phase. Let me find a page number for you. Cephalic phase on 890. This phase is also known as the reflex phase. So the cephalic phase, cephalo means it means head. So if you can think of this as the stuff that happens in your head. So it's the phase where you're smelling things, tasting things, thinking of things, seeing things. I think for most of us, popcorn is up there. For some reason, popcorn and cookies. You smell those things, and it actually starts the process of digestion. It starts it. So the second phase is known as the gastric phase, and the third phase is your intestinal phase. Let me just see. Okay. So your gastric phase takes between 3 and 4 hours, and then your intestinal phase is going to be where we have chyme entering the small intestine. And so we pass through this pyloric sphincter, and we're squeezing just like a little bit at a time. 3 milliliters is not much at all. It's less than a teaspoon. It's half a teaspoon, almost a little bit more than half. So very small amount of chyme at a time. After we've been through that gastric phase. So once we've digested for a while, 3 to 4 hours. It's a lot longer for certain like fibrous materials take a lot longer. The stomach phase, it depends on what you ate. But then the chyme will start to move into the pyloric sphincter in spurts. So that could take several more hours. So we're now entering into the beginning of the small intestine. All right, so before we get there, let's talk about vomiting. Emesis is a term. Emesis is a suffix that means vomiting. In pregnancy, we use hyperemesis, which means excessive vomiting. But we also have hematemesis, which is bloody vomit. So there's emesis and emesis. I don't really know which one, why we use it pronounced one way versus the other in certain words, but vomiting is triggered by lots of things. Nerves can do it, but also if something gets into the body that we're just, we can't have this. Something that our body sees as a danger, it will expel it, get it out of the body as soon as it can. So the medulla has a special center which triggers motor responses. So it's known as the emetic or emetic center, and that is going to trigger, again, autonomic responses. So we all have thrown up at some point in our lives, and the things that happen, you start to breathe faster, the diaphragm and abs start to contract, the GE sphincter actually relaxes. It's not supposed to do this, but in a vomiting situation it will. And so food can now enter into the esophagus where it normally wouldn't. And then the uvula will block the nasopharynx to prevent vomit from coming out the nose. All of this happens while we've closed off our airways. And the esophagus, remember, does not have the mucus secretions that the stomach had that would protect the stomach. And so it hurts. So now we're moving into the next phase of our digestion, which is the small intestine. And if you're writing your list here, you would have the pyloric valve or pyloric sphincter. And then right after that, you'd have small intestine. And I would divide the small intestine into the 3 subdivisions that are here down at the bottom: duodenum, jejunum, ileum. So we had stratified squamous epithelium through the mouth, the pharynx, the esophagus. And then when we got to the small intestine, or the stomach, we are now simple columnar epithelium, and we're staying simple columnar epithelium throughout the small and large intestines until the very end. And so gross anatomy of the small intestine, made of 3 parts, 2 to 4 meters long when you're alive. That extends at death because of all the relaxing of the tissue. And so it starts with the pyloric sphincter, and then it's going to proceed to be called the duodenum or duodenum in the beginning. Then it's going to become the jejunum, and then the end of it is the ileum. And at the end of the ileum, there is a valve right here, known as the ileocecal valve. They have ileocecal junction here. My shirt is all crooked. Sorry. Okay. So the ileocecal junction or ileocecal valve. Because this big thing is the large intestine, and the beginning of the large intestine is known as the cecum. So ileum cecum. So you can remember DJ ileum. So DJ ileum in the house. Sorry. So DJ ileum is the order: duodenum, jejunum, ileum. And notice that ileum is spelled different than the bone. But it is nice to kind of have an idea, okay, ileum is down in that area, the iliac bone. All right, so the duodenum is retroperitoneal. It's the stomach is forward a bit, and then the duodenum kind of snakes a little bit behind. So that's retroperitoneal. The jejunum and the ileum are not. They're intraperitoneal. So the jejunum is next, and the ileum is next. They're both attached to the back wall by mesenteries. All right, duodenum, smallest part of the small intestine at about 10 inches. At that point, we're going to discuss, there's a hole there called the sphincter of Oddi. And at that location, we're going to have some bile entering into the duodenum, and we have some pancreatic secretions secreting into the duodenum. So remember, we've got food being squeezed into that location. It's all mushy and it's very acidic, and we need to do something with it before it continues along its way. And so we have some of our accessory organs adding fluid to that area. The jejunum is about 8 feet long, and then the ileum is about 12 feet long. So, and at the end of the ileum was again that ileocecal valve or sphincter. And if you're writing your list, I would just continue it along, including that. The small intestine is where we're going to absorb our nutrients. There are lots of modifications in place for that. And so we have our circular folds. Sometimes they're known as plicae circulares. I'm going to try to find that for you. Hold on. So things in this textbook are a little bit different than the way I'm discussing them. I like to talk about the main structures and then afterward discuss the fluids that go into them. But this picture is on 902. So plicae circulares, or circular folds. They're folds that are in the lining of the small intestine, and their job is to, couple jobs. One is that they have, when you have these ridges, it allows for a lot more surface area. But two, the ridges help spiral the food through that tube so that it's not all smushing down really fast. So the folds tend to slow it down and force the chyme to spiral through. That allows us to absorb more nutrients out of that food. So then we have the villi or villi, and those are little tiny finger-like projections that are on the surface of these circular folds. And this is what each one looks like. In the middle of each villus, you see blood vessels right in here. You're also going to see lacteals, which we discussed before. So your lacteals are part of your lymphatic system. And their job is going to be to absorb fat. And then on top of those, we have some little tiny microvilli, which further increase digestion, but also they have some enzymes that can help continue the process of starch and protein digestion. So they're going to secrete those. And all of this happens in the small intestine. All right, so we secrete, 1 to 2 liters of intestinal juice. So we secrete like a lot of juice, but 1 to 2 liters daily of intestinal juice, and it responds whether there's a stretching of the mucosal lining, which is going to indicate that there's something coming along, or if something is irritating the lining, that's going to indicate, okay, I must have to do my job, and then we'll see beginning of that secretion. So intestinal juice is slightly alkaline. Remember that alkaline is more basic. It's the larger numbers on the pH scale, and we said that the stomach and the chyme coming out of the stomach was acidic because hydrochloric acid has like a pH of 0, 1, 2. So it makes sense that we have an acid coming into the intestine, and then we have some juices that are alkaline, because this is going to help neutralize the acids coming from the stomach. So the intestinal juice, its big job is to continue a little bit of digesting, but to allow for absorption to begin. This diagram is the beginning of the small intestine. So if you're looking right here, this is the small intestine. And so right over here would have been like the pyloric valve or pyloric sphincter. And then here's our liver. This little green guy is the gallbladder. And then this is the pancreas. And so this being the small intestine, the duodenum, what we're focused on right now is this right here. So this little guy is, if you can see, hopefully, it's going to be a spot where this tube and this tube dump into the duodenum. It's a little hole. And so at this particular spot in the small intestine, we're going to have bile coming and digestive enzymes coming. Food comes through and it's going to be hit right away with intestinal juices, with juices coming from the pancreas, with bile coming from the liver and gallbladder. So there's a lot happening in this particular location. So in order to absorb those nutrients the way we need to make sure that it's digested properly. We need to make sure that it's delivered slowly and mixed properly. I think I just said that, but okay. So delivered slowly, the chyme has to come slowly out of the stomach. It needs to spiral slowly through the intestines. Partially digested stuff, we're including the lipases from the stomach, but they're not really doing anything yet. For fats, we have the delivery of bile, which is coming from the gallbladder. We have enzymes and bicarbonate from the liver and pancreas. So mostly the pancreas is going to be another neutralizer. Bicarbonate is going to neutralize acids. So we'll talk about these a little bit as we move forward. So the first one we're going to talk about, and we already talked about segmentation and peristalsis. So we're going to move on to, sorry, I sneezed. Okay, so we're going to move on to discussing some reflexes, and then we're going to move on to talking about what the liver and gallbladder do, how they make what they make, and then we'll move on to the pancreas. All right. Once you get to the end of the small intestine, we have the ileocecal sphincter or ileocecal valve, and that's going to allow chyme to secrete into the large intestine. This is going to happen with a couple of factors in place. One is something called the gastroileal reflex. And remember that the ileum is the beginning of the large intestine. So we would have all the stages of the small intestine. At the end of that, we would have the ileocecal valve. I think, yeah. So the ileum, I'm sorry, the ileum is the very end of the small intestine. So after that small end of the small intestine, we'd have the ileocecal valve, and then we'd have what's called the cecum. And the cecum would be, of course, the beginning of the large intestine. So that gastroileal reflex is gonna it's gonna cause the food that's in the lower part of the small intestine, the ileal food, it's gonna force the segmentation and the squeezing of that a little bit stronger. And there's also a hormone that's involved that increases the motility or movement of the food in the ileum. So we have two factors, a hormonal factor and a reflex factor. They're going to force that food or the remnants from the ileum into past the ileocecal valve and into the beginning of the large intestine. And those ileocecal valve flaps, because it's a valve, are meant to be one way. So once food goes into that section or once waste goes into the large intestine, it's not going to go backward. It's the same as the valves of the heart. Here's our picture one more time of the liver and the gallbladder. So let's discuss the pancreas is on the couple slides. So we'll focus on the liver and the gallbladder here. So the liver is very, very large. It's our largest gland, and it is very vascular and heavy. So it's always going to look a purplish color because of the darkness of it is coming from blood. So the liver does lots and lots of things, but for digestive purposes, the job of the liver is to produce something called bile. And bile is almost like a detergent that can be used to break fat into pieces. So if you can picture, you made bacon in a frying pan and you try to wash it without adding any soap, you're going to end up with it. You're just going to have huge fat droplets. That's what there's going to be. So if you add soap to it, you can break those fat droplets into smaller pieces. And that's what bile does for our fats. And so the liver makes the bile, and then the bile is going to go down a little duct called the cystic duct. Let me give you a page number. Like I said, the pages in this chapter are a little bit mixed up. It's different than the way I usually do it, but this picture is on 900. And so the liver makes the bile, and then it gets stored into the gallbladder. The gallbladder just sits there. It kind of concentrates the bile, like it takes the water out of the bile, makes it really, really concentrated. And when you eat a fatty meal, the gallbladder will contract and squeeze some of that bile through a duct called the cystic duct, and then it's going to enter into the bile duct. From there, it's going to drain right down into the duodenum. Cystic, by the way, means bladder, and cholesterol. I'm sorry. The actual term for gallbladder is CHOLE is the word we use associated with gallbladder and bile. And it's made of cholesterol. So cholesterol has a function in our body besides just in membranes. It's good for a lot of things. So the other term here that I wanted to discuss with you was the falciform ligament. So the liver is really heavy. And let me make sure I have it. Okay. Right here, falciform ligament holds the liver to the wall of the abdomen. Kind of runs along. Let's talk a little bit more about bile now. So bile is yellow greenish color, and it is alkaline. It feels like acid when you throw up, but it's actually alkaline, and it's made of bile salts, which comes from cholesterol. And what these bile salts do is they emulsify fats. Emulsifying fat means breaking it down kind of into smaller parts, into smaller fat droplets. And what that means is that we're now, once the droplets are small, we can now absorb them a little bit easier. So that's what that bile does. We also have bilirubin. You don't need to understand the function of bilirubin, but it is formed from heme, the heme group of hemoglobin, and we break that down in our intestines. The bacteria that live in our gut are the ones that do the breaking down, and it makes a brown color instead of this yellowish color called stercobilin. Okay, and so lots of things are involved with bile. It has cholesterol in it, as we mentioned. It does have some neutral fats, which you don't need to worry about. Some electrolytes, things that are going to be involved with, you know, the action of breaking down substances. So I would just worry about your bold-faced words right now. All right. Okay, so then we have the pancreas. Pancreas is mostly retroperitoneal, so we have our stomach here. Our beginning part of our duodenum and our pancreas are mostly retroperitoneal, right? So they sit behind the peritoneal membrane. It has two sections, the head and the tail. Those are really just landmarking terms. And then we have a couple of different functions. One function that we're not worried about today is known as the endocrine function. The endocrine function is right here, highlighted here. You see these little cells that look like little purple blobs. We call these little islets. They're little islands. And these guys, they're known as the islets of Langerhans, and they secrete hormones. They secrete insulin and glucagon, which control blood sugar. Their job is going to be, they're going to be secreted right into the bloodstream. That's not what we're concerned about. Our concern today is about the exocrine function. So your exocrine function, we have these acinar cells, and their job is to secrete pancreatic juice, which is going to follow these arrows and go into the duodenum, and this top one was from the bile. And so we have this pancreatic juice, and we have bile, both coming into the duodenum at the same time. Pancreatic juice, up to 1,500 milliliters a day. Again, little bit alkaline again, which is going to neutralize that very acidic kind that's coming out of the stomach. It also has electrolytes, again, which is going to allow for that neutralization. And then we have different enzymes. So let's look at these parts. So amylase, anytime you see ACE, it has to do with, it's an enzyme. And so amylo, this has to do with starch. We have lipase, this is lipid, or all right, fat. Nucleases, going to involve nucleic acids, so we're talking about like DNA, RNA, and proteases, which are going to be involved with proteins. So we have our starches, our fats, our proteins, all being broken down by, you know, enzymes that are coming from the stomach, from the duodenum itself, from the pancreas, from the liver. All of those are necessary. All of these different chemicals are necessary to get the food broken down into components small enough to be digested, or absorbed, really, rather. All right, moving forward. I'll probably make myself disappear again in a minute. So now we have left the small intestine through the ileocecal valve, and we've entered into the large intestine. The large intestine is so weird. It goes up, this is the pathway of the food, over, and then down, and then curvy, and then out. And so the large intestine is known as the large intestine because of the diameter of the vessel or of the tube. So it's wide. The terms that we use to describe the large intestine. First of all, it's also simple columnar epithelium, and its job, let me erase this. Its job is to, the whole way that the food is going along here, we've absorbed most of what we need to absorb. So at this point, we're moving along and we are absorbing water along the way, still simple columnar. And we're also in this colon, or in the large intestine, we have bacteria that live there, naturally live there. There's 100 trillion bacteria that live on us and in us, so they are not bad, but, well, some of them are. But the ones that live in here, hopefully, are the good ones, and they are really helpful in creating vitamins for us. And those are also absorbed through the walls of the large intestine. So the large intestine is going to kind of compact the food, continue absorbing water, and we have, again, the creation of some of those vitamins. So the regions of the large intestine. Cecum is down here, C-E-C-U-M. This little guy right here that looks like a worm, this is the appendix. So cecum, all of this section is known as the colon. And then this whole area in here, we've now turned back to stratified squamous epithelium. And then this is the anal canal and anus. In the large intestine, residue can remain in there for a long time, and longer if you are dehydrated or constipated. Food is not broken down there. Water is absorbed. There's some vitamins that are made there. Within that water, we're also absorbing electrolytes, salts. The vitamins that are made there are the Burger King vitamins, I call them, but B and K. So vitamin K is involved with blood clotting, if you can remember back a little while ago, and the B vitamins are useful in lots of ways in energy metabolism. So we have absorption of salts and water. We have defecation and compacting waste. So defecation is removing the waste out of the body, and we don't need the colon. And so people have colostomies, they might have cancer of the colon, they might have Crohn's disease, they might have reasons that their colon is not functional, and so they can use a colostomy bag instead. So you don't need the colon to survive. Parts of the colon, page 907. Has the picture that I'm going to show you on the next page. So again, the colon is retroperitoneal. There are some sections of the colon that are regular peritoneal, intraperitoneal, but a lot of it is retroperitoneal. So the first part we have is known as the ascending colon. The ascending colon runs along the right side, and it started out at the level of, it started out at the cecum. So we had the cecum down at the bottom with the little appendix attached. We had our small intestine coming into it. So the part that's going to go up like this is the ascending colon, and then it's going to bend and then go down and turn a little bit. So that's what the large intestine would look like. And our ascending colon, I'm going to highlight right here, is this guy. This little bend right here is known as the right colic flexure. And sometimes we call it the hepatic flexure because the liver sits right over here in this area. So then we have a section that goes right across called the transverse colon. And then we have another bend. This is the left colic flexure, and the spleen is right here. So we call it also the splenic flexure. So then we have the descending colon. And then we have a curve, which is called the sigmoid colon, and that sigmoid colon becomes the rectum. So we have cecum at the ileocecal valve with the appendix. We have ascending colon, right colic flexure, transverse colon, left colic flexure, descending colon, sigmoid colon, rectum. And this is a much better picture than the one I just tried to draw. So one more time. We have our appendix and cecum. We have the ileocecal valve, so that actually came first. Ascending colon, right colic flexure, transverse colon, left colic flexure, descending colon, sigmoid colon, rectum, and then we didn't discuss anal canal or external anal sphincter yet, but that's what's last. Okay, we're doing great. We're almost done. Hang in there, or press pause and come back. So once we reach the rectum, we're pretty much done. We've done everything we can do with this food. And this food is now hard because it's been dehydrated, right? So the fecal matter is hard, and we need to go back to the stratified squamous epithelium again. And so we have our stratified squamous, and it's gonna line the rectum. So the rectum actually has valves in it. They're called rectal valves. There's a picture on 907. I don't think I put them in this. I didn't. But they are on 907. Those valves are meant to prevent fecal matter from coming out when someone farts. So they're meant to keep, let gas out, but keep the fecal matter in until you're ready. So the rectum has muscles that are going to contract to expel the feces. Valsalva's maneuver we talked about a few times is also going to help in that getting poop out, fecal matter out. So then the very last section after the anus is after the rectum is the anal canal, and it opens. The anus is the actual opening. It's like the glottis or the iris, or I'm sorry, pupil. They're just whole openings. So the opening is known as the anus, and there are two sphincters. One of them is internal, one of them is external. So the internal anal sphincter is smooth muscle. You don't have control over that one. The external anal sphincter is skeletal muscle, and you do have control over that one. When we get to the urinary system, you'll find it's the same two things. Two sphincters, one's internal, one's external, but they're called urethral sphincters instead of anal sphincters. One is smooth muscle, one is skeletal muscle. This is on, again, 907. The last section here is about what's happening with these chemicals. So I kind of went over them a little bit quickly before because I knew I would be doing them at the end here. So we're going to talk a little bit more about those chemical processes that are involved as we're breaking down the nutrients. We talked a lot about the physical digestion, about how we get it to where it needs to be, and the pathway, but now we need to talk about what the processes are that break them down. So we already mentioned mechanical and chemical digestion. We already said that mechanical breaks things into smaller pieces, and the chemical digestion breaks these smaller pieces into chemicals, smaller building blocks that can be absorbed into the bloodstream. When we're breaking food down, or breaking anything down, we use the word catabolism. So what we are doing is definitely catabolism. So we're going to start by discussing a little bit more about enzymes. All right, and so one of the terms that possibly you learned in the past when it came to basic chemistry stuff was hydrolysis. And so hydro means water, and lysis means destroying. So enzymes work by using, so they're a protein that's going to be active in breaking things apart or building them up. Hydrolysis involves adding water to split things into two. So we add water, but we're splitting hydrolysis. Let me give you a page number. I'm gonna pause till I can find it. Hold on. Okay, so this is page 912. We mentioned a little bit earlier that there were different classifications of food that we need to break down. So there were the carbohydrates, and we used the term amylase to break that down. We had proteins we needed to break down. There were the proteases. Fats would be the lipases, and our nucleic acids, the nucleases. So nucleic acids would be the DNA, the RNA that we'd find in the things we eat. Carbohydrates. The only thing that we can absorb are known as monosaccharides. So carbohydrates in general are made of sugar, lots of sugar, many sugars combined together. So carbohydrates would be known as a polysaccharide. Poly means many. Poly is many. Mono, therefore, means one. And saccharose, S-A-C-C-H-A-R-O, means sugar. So in order for a carbohydrate to be absorbed, we need to make it smaller so that it's just one sugar instead of many sugars. And so we can only absorb monosaccharides. And so the enzymes that we use to break those down are amylases. So there's some come from the salivary glands, there's some that come from the pancreatic glands or the pancreas, but they're amylases. There's a few others too, but amylase in general is the one you should know for breaking down carbohydrates. And disaccharides are two sugars, polysaccharides are multiple sugars. No matter what kind of combination of sugar you are, you still need to be a monosaccharide in order to be absorbed. And so that's where these amylases are going to come in and make it so that we can absorb those. This is a little diagram. This is on page 913. You don't need to memorize all the names of these simple sugars, but you should understand the top here where we have our starches, and disaccharides means two sugar together. We add amylase from the salivary glands, we had amylase from the pancreas, and we've broken down into smaller pieces until eventually we get down into our tiniest pieces, which we can then absorb in the small intestine. Proteins we already discussed a little bit. We said that we're going to start with pepsin in the stomach, and the stomach has to be a pH of around 2 in order for this to work, for the pepsin to break down the proteins. And so we need to add the hydrochloric acid. So then once we begin that digestion, we start it, but then once it enters into the small intestine, we now don't have that acidic environment anymore, and so there are proteases that come from the pancreas. They're added to the duodenum that continue to finish up the job. So trypsin, chymotrypsin, carboxypeptidase are different ones. I would need you to know just the term protease. I don't need you to memorize the names of all of the these little individual proteases. So here we have a same thing, breakdown here. So we have our proteins at the top, which we have pepsin coming from the stomach in the presence of hydrochloric acid. Then we have that protein broken down into smaller pieces. The pancreatic enzymes are going to do a job there. And then we have further digestion by brush border enzymes coming from the small intestine to break it into the smallest parts, which are known as amino acids. Those are the smallest parts of proteins. So as far as lipids, you can't do anything with the lipid until you've added bile to it. So we need to emulsify or break the lipid down into smaller chunks with the bile from the gallbladder and liver. That's what has to happen first. So then as it continues along its way, we also have some stuff coming in from the pancreas called lipase. That's going to also start breaking things down. And that's when we can start absorbing the lipids. At this point, the lipids are broken into fatty acids and glycerol. Those are just smaller components of the lipid, and they can be absorbed through lacteals. So those were lymphatic vessels that we'd find within the villi or villi. And then they're transported to the hepatic portal vein or lymph. But they're getting into the bloodstream. It's just a little bit of a different route than the rest of the nutrients because they're kind of too large to be sent right into the bloodstream. They have to be like entering in through that lymphatic circulation. And so we didn't really talk about lingual lipase, but gastric lipase we did talk a little bit about. We've got the bile salts coming from the liver, and then we have pancreatic ones as well. All right, so last couple slides here. Up to 10 liters of food and drink enter the GI tract every day. Out of that, 90% of it is absorbed, and 90% of it doesn't even make it to the large intestine. All of the food and a lot of the water has to be absorbed in the small intestine. Most of it happens before the ileum. And then the ileum is going to be a spot where we can grab those bile salts and they can be reused to make new bile. Obviously not all of it, but. Okay, and then we have vitamins being produced and absorbed. So we can absorb some vitamins directly through the small intestine, vitamins we eat. So vitamins that are fat soluble are ones that you need to have fat to absorb. A, D, E, and K. And then we have water-soluble vitamins. Vitamin C and B can diffuse into the bloodstream. And then vitamin B12 is much more complex. We're not going to discuss vitamin B12, but it is absorbed by what we call endocytosis, which is like phagocytosis. It's where the cell is, a molecule is absorbed. The cell kind of grabs it and pulls it into the cell. All right, now as far as water absorption, 95% that's absorbed in the small intestine is absorbed by osmosis. So remember, water wants to go from where there's a lot to where there's less. And so there's a lot more water in the intestines than in the bloodstream. And so the water wants to go into the bloodstream. It's a natural process. Net osmosis occurs whenever a concentration gradient is established by an active transport of solutes. Again, don't worry about that. Higher concentration to lower concentration. All right, so that's our last slide. I'm going to go back and try to fix those few that I messed up, and if I can't, I apologize. Otherwise, I will talk to you in the next video.